Well, notice God says, Jerry, if you can't afford a bull, you can bring a lamb. If you can't bring a lamb, you can bring 2 birds. The main thing about God is you want to worship. Okay, now the burnt offering. You'll notice that it is all burnt on the altar. The grain offering or the meal offering, sometimes when we watch the Jewel Mill or film strips, especially, we're always taught everything they brought had to be a bloody sacrifice. It didn't. This is grain. This is grain. They're going to grind it up into flour. Chapter 2, verse 1, when anyone offers a grain offering to the Lord, his offering shall be a fine flour, and he shall pour oil on it, put frankincense on it, he shall bring it to Aaron's sons, the priest, one of whom shall take from it his handful of fine flour and oil with all the frankincense. The priest shall burn it as a memorial on the altar, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. The rest of the grain offering shall be Aaron's and his sons. Here's part of the income of the priest. Remember, the priest did not receive any land as such when they came to the promised land. The Levites received 48 cities and the common land around it, but they did not receive any property as such. So here you have the meal offering. Burnt offering basically this is totally dedicated to God. Somebody bringing a burnt offering says, God, I am totally dedicated to you. Now, isn't that what we do when we become Christians? We submit to Christ and say that He is Lord. That means He is the one in authority, can tell us what to do, and we're going to submit to His authority. The meal offering is also the offering of your industry. You're bringing God your first fruits. God, this is what I've done with my life. This is like Romans chapter 12 and verse 2, where it says, and submit yourselves as living sacrifices. Present yourselves as living sacrifices, which is your reasonable or your service of worship. The peace offering in chapter 3. The peace offering in chapter 3. This is basically a fellowship meal. You bring your offering. Chapter 3. When his offering is the sacrifice of a peace offering, if he offers it of the herd, whether of male or female, he shall offer it without blemish before the Lord. When you offer anything to God, you offer the best that you have. Now that is different than what I was taught growing up. That's one place where Debbie had to give me an attitude adjustment. Because the way I was taught about bringing something to God was, I first take care of me and my family. And then if anything's left over, I'm going to give some of that to God. Well, when you're really letting God have total control of your life, you end up realizing you owe Him part as I've been prospering. Okay? I'll guarantee you, folks, Deborah took over our checkbook because I made a lot of bills last year. Most of those bills were not because I wanted a new car, or I wanted a new boat, or I wanted you know, some of that stuff. I got a new telescope several years ago. But, but you know, I have a lot of bills. You know, I had those 2 surgeries and all that. And I'm waiting, Alvin, to find out about my income tax. I hope that my income tax, I get a good check instead of having to write one. But you know, one thing that Deborah gave me an attitude adjustment was, honey, you don't give like we're supposed to give. And basically she said, you're making me feel guilty because we blessed more than what you're wanting to give. And man, we argued. But anyway, here at church we have fellowship meals. This is in the Old Testament, was their fellowship meal. It was a fellowship meal between God, between the worshiper and his family, and the priest. God wanted the people to have contact with the priest. When you study about this peace offering, it says that this was a very important, it was a whole day event, basically. When the family would talk to the priest about spiritual things. When the family would talk to the priest and receive counseling. It says in verse 3, "He shall offer from the sacrifice of the peace offering an offering made by fire to the Lord, the fat that covers the entrails and all the fat that is on the entrails, the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is on them by the flanks, and the fatty lobe attached to the liver above the kidneys he shall remove, and Aaron's sons shall burn it on the altar upon the burnt sacrifice, which is on the wood that is on the fire, as an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord." You notice how many times it says about the fat. Now go to the end of chapter 3 and notice verse 17. "This shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations in all your dwellings. You shall eat neither fat nor blood." Another verse says the fat belongs to God. Now if you remember the story of Samuel, 1 Samuel, Eli's sons were wicked men. They were priests. They were in line to be the next 2 judges of Israel. These 2 guys, when these people would bring their peace offerings, would bring their offering to God, these guys didn't want the food that God wanted them to have. They wanted the fat too. They looked with contempt on God's offering. And they weren't satisfied with God, what God was giving them. But notice that's the peace offering. This lets us know of the peace and the tranquility and the serenity that we have because we're God's people. Chapter 4 and 5 talk about the sin offering and the trespass offering, and I'm going to have to hurry through these. Sin offering is, and notice here, in verse 2 of chapter 4, if a person sins unintentionally against any of the commandments of the Lord, the sin offering is, I do something wrong, but it was not my motive. Okay? You know, for instance, I'm out there building on something, whoop, and I hit my thumb and I go, I would have to take a sin offering to God. I didn't mean to do that. Okay? Now, one thing that you find out is if there's a sin that I meant to do, I mean, I planned it and I did it, the Bible says there is no sacrifice for that sin. Now, this is something hard for me to realize, but when you think, I'm going to have to study this out some more. David committed an intentional sin. I mean, he looked over and saw Bathsheba, and he wanted her, and he took her. He planned to deceive her husband. When that didn't work, he planned his murder and had him killed. There is no sacrifice that David or Bathsheba, especially David, there is no sacrifice that David could offer because that was an intentional sin. But here's the deal. Did God forgive him? Yeah, he did. How many times do we sin intentionally? How does that work? That's called grace. But here's the sin offering. Now, if you look at this, again, the sin offering goes, if you have a lot of money, you bring this. If you don't have a lot of money, you bring this. Even in the sin offering, if I am poverty-stricken, I don't even have to bring birds. I don't have to bring blood. I can bring grain. God makes provisions for us to draw close to Him even when we don't have as much as somebody else. And then you have the trespass offering. This occurs in 3 different ways. I can see something happen. Notice in verse 1 of chapter 5. If a person sins in hearing an utterance of an oath, and is a witness, whether he has seen or known of the matter, if he does not tell it, he bears guilt. So if I withhold information, I'm guilty. In verse 2, if a person touches any unclean thing, and right at the end of verse 2, and he is unaware of it, he also shall be unclean and guilty. Okay? In verse 4, if a person swears speaking thoughtlessly with his lips to do evil or to do good, whatever it is that a man may pronounce by an oath and he is unaware of it, when he realizes it, then he shall be guilty in any of these matters. Now here's what you have to do in the trespass offering. It shall be, when he is guilty in any of these matters, that he shall confess that he has sinned in that thing. And he brings his trespass offering in verse 6 right at the end, so the priest shall make atonement for him concerning his sin. Now you go a little bit farther, and it talks about, beginning in verse 14, if something involving property is involved in verse 16, he shall make restitution for the harm that he has done in regard to the holy thing, and shall add 1/50 it and give it to the priest.